They say you can't teach an old dog new tricks, but nobody warned me that sometimes the old dog has to learn to bite back. At 73, I discovered that the gentle woman I thought I was had claws I never knew existed. The morning light filtered through my kitchen window, casting familiar shadows across the worn linoleum floor. I had been making the same breakfast for 47 years in this house. But today, something felt different. Maybe it was the way the silence seemed heavier, or how my reflection in the coffee pot looked more fragile than usual. Robert had been gone for 8 months now, and the emptiness still caught me off guard at unexpected moments. I was stirring honey into my tea when the phone rang. Even before I answered, I knew it would be Margaret, my daughter-in-law, calling from California with that particular tone she reserved for what she considered my failures as a grandmother and mother. Her voice crackled through the receiver with forced cheerfulness. She wanted to discuss Thanksgiving plans, she said, but within minutes the conversation had shifted to its usual territory. Why hadn't I sent a birthday card to little Emma? Did I realize how disappointed the children were? When was I going to stop wallowing in grief and start being present for my family again? I listened to her litany of complaints while watching a cardinal outside my window. The bird pecked persistently at its own reflection in the glass, over and over, never learning that what it was fighting was just itself. Margaret's words washed over me like they had for the past 23 years, since she married my son David. I had learned long ago that defending myself only prolonged these conversations. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen chair for what felt like hours. The cardinal had finally given up its battle with the window and flown away. I wondered if it felt as exhausted as I did. The truth was, I had sent Emma a birthday card. I had also sent her a hand-knitted sweater in her favorite color, purple, and a book I thought she might enjoy. But Margaret had a way of rewriting history to fit her narrative. And in her version, I was always the neglectful grandmother who cared more about my own sorrow than my family's happiness. Later that morning, I walked to my mailbox and found a thick envelope from David and Margaret. Inside was a brochure for Sunset Manor, a senior living facility about an hour away from their home. A yellow sticky note in Margaret's handwriting was attached to the front. Mom, we think it's time to consider your options. The house is too much for you now, and you shouldn't be alone. We've scheduled a tour for next Tuesday. Love, David and Margaret. I stood in my driveway, holding that brochure, feeling something crack inside my chest. They hadn't asked me how I felt about leaving the home Robert and I had built together. They hadn't inquired whether I wanted to move closer to them. They had simply decided what was best for me and expected me to comply. That evening, I called David directly. His voice sounded distracted, and I could hear the television in the background. When I asked about the brochure, he sighed in that particular way that made me feel like a burden. He explained that they were worried about me. The house was too big, too isolated. What if I fell? What if something happened and no one found me for days? Margaret had researched several facilities, and Sunset Manor had excellent reviews. They could visit me more often if I lived closer. It made sense, didn't it? I found myself nodding along, even though he couldn't see me. Yes, I said, it made sense. Yes, I would consider it. Yes, I understood they were worried. But after I hung up, I sat in Robert's old chair and cried for the first time since his funeral. The next few days blurred together in a haze of phone calls and arrangements I hadn't asked for. Margaret called twice daily with updates about the tour, about paperwork I would need to fill out, about how to start downsizing my belongings. She spoke about my life like it was a problem to be solved rather than a story worth preserving. My neighbor, Eleanor, stopped by on Thursday with fresh tomatoes from her garden. She had known Robert and me for 30 years, and she could tell something was wrong. When I showed her the brochure, her face darkened. She asked if this was what I wanted. The question caught me off guard, because no one else had bothered to ask. I realized I didn't even know what I wanted anymore. For so long, I had defined myself through other people's needs and expectations that my own desires had become foreign territory. Eleanor sat with me at my kitchen table, the same table where Robert and I had shared thousands of meals, where we had helped David with his homework where we had planned our modest dreams for retirement. She told me about her own struggles with her children's well-meaning interference after her husband died 5 years earlier. Her words planted a seed of something I had almost forgotten existed: the possibility that I had choices. That weekend, David and Margaret arrived for the scheduled visit to Sunset Manor. Margaret bustled around my house, making notes about what furniture might fit in a smaller space and what would need to be donated or sold. She spoke about my possessions like they were obstacles rather than memories. The tour of Sunset Manor was professionally cheerful. The staff smiled constantly. The hallways smelled like industrial disinfectant and artificial flowers. And everything was beige. Margaret asked practical questions about meal plans and medication management, while I stood quietly beside them, feeling like a piece of furniture being evaluated for placement. The director, a woman with aggressively blonde hair and a voice like spun sugar, showed us a available room. It was clean and adequate, with a single window that looked out onto a parking lot. She pointed out the efficient kitchenette, the spacious bathroom with safety bars, and the comfortable chair positioned perfectly for watching television. Margaret squeezed my arm and whispered that it was perfect. David nodded approvingly and asked about the timeline for move-in. Nobody asked what I thought about spending my remaining years in a beige box, watching other people's cars come and go. On the drive back to my house, Margaret chatted excitedly about how much easier everything would be. I could make friends with other residents. I wouldn't have to worry about maintaining the house or the garden. The staff would handle meal preparation and housekeeping. I would be safe and cared for. She painted a picture of golden years spent in comfortable dependency, and I suppose it sounded reasonable to her. But as I looked out the car window at the familiar landscape of my hometown, I felt something inside me hardening like concrete. That evening, after David and Margaret had returned to their hotel, I walked through my house with new eyes. Every room held decades of carefully chosen details. The wallpaper in the dining room that Robert and I had hung ourselves after 3 arguments and 2 trips to the hardware store. The kitchen window where I had watched seasons change for nearly half a century. The garden where Robert had proposed to me 49 years ago. Where we had buried 3 beloved dogs and planted a tree for each grandchild. This wasn't just a house that had become too much for me to handle. This was the physical manifestation of a life fully lived, of love carefully tended, of dreams planted and harvested. Margaret saw burden and inconvenience. I saw everything that mattered. The next morning, I called the director at Sunset Manor and canceled the application. My voice shook as I spoke, but I managed to be clear and firm. I thanked her for her time but explained that I had decided to remain in my own home. Then I called David. The conversation was more difficult than I had anticipated. He was confused, then concerned, then frustrated. He reminded me of all the practical reasons why moving made sense. He worried about my isolation, my safety, my stubbornness. But for the first time in decades, I didn't apologize for disappointing him. I didn't rush to reassure him that his concerns were valid and that I would reconsider. Instead, I told him simply that I had made my decision and that I hoped he could respect it. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, but I didn't fill it with nervous chatter or backtracking. I waited. Finally, David said he didn't understand why I was being so difficult. Margaret came on the line, her voice tight with barely controlled irritation. She reminded me that they were only trying to help, that they had spent time and effort researching options for me, that I was being ungrateful and unrealistic. I listened to her lecture about my selfishness and impracticality, and something remarkable happened. Instead of the familiar shame and guilt, I felt a strange kind of clarity. I could hear the manipulation in her tone, the way she tried to make my autonomy sound like a character flaw. When she finished speaking, I thanked them both for their concern and told them I loved them. Then I hung up. The following weeks were challenging, in ways I hadn't expected. David called several times, his voice alternating between worry and frustration. Margaret sent long emails detailing newspaper articles about elderly people who had fallen in their homes or had medical emergencies while alone. They painted catastrophic pictures of my future and implied that I was being recklessly stubborn. I began to doubt myself. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was being foolish and prideful. Maybe love meant accepting their practical wisdom about my limitations. But then I would walk through my garden, touching the roses Robert and I had planted for our 20th anniversary. Or I would sit in the living room where we had celebrated every Christmas morning for decades, and I remembered why this mattered. I started making changes, small ones at first. I hired a teenager from down the street to help with yard work. I arranged for grocery delivery and found a cleaning service run by a local woman who charged reasonable rates. I researched medical alert systems and chose one that seemed sensible without being intrusive. Most importantly, I began reaching out to old friends I had lost touch with over the years. I discovered that several other women in my situation were navigating similar challenges with their adult children. We started meeting for coffee once a week, and those conversations became a lifeline. Eleanor introduced me to her book club, and I rediscovered my love of reading. I joined a volunteer program at the local library, helping children with reading difficulties. Slowly, I began to remember who I was beyond my roles as wife, mother, and grandmother. The real test came at Thanksgiving. David and Margaret arrived with the children, but the atmosphere was strained. Margaret moved through my house with the air of someone inspecting a potential disaster zone. She questioned whether the stair railings were secure enough, wondered aloud about the safety of my old stove, and made pointed comments about how isolated I was. During dinner, she brought up Sunset Manor again. Several of her friends had parents who lived in similar facilities and were very happy, she said. Wouldn't I at least visit a few more options? Wasn't I being a bit stubborn about this whole situation? I set down my fork and looked around the table at my family. David avoided my eyes, focusing intently on his mashed potatoes. The children sensed the tension and had grown quiet. Margaret waited for my response with the patient expression of someone accustomed to getting her way. Instead of the defensive speech I might have given months earlier, I spoke quietly and calmly. I told them I appreciated their concern, but I had made my decision. I had taken steps to address their practical worries while maintaining my independence. I hoped they could support my choice to remain in my own home. Margaret's face flushed, and she began to list all the ways my decision was unreasonable and potentially dangerous. But this time, I didn't engage with her arguments. I didn't justify or defend or explain. I simply repeated that my decision was final. The rest of the visit was awkward, but I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace with my own choices. When they left the next morning, Margaret hugged me stiffly and said she hoped I would reconsider before it was too late. David kissed my cheek and whispered that he worried about me. I told them both that I loved them and that they were welcome to visit any time. But I didn't promise to reconsider, and I didn't apologize for the disappointment in their eyes. The months that followed brought their own challenges. David called less frequently, and when he did, our conversations felt stilted and careful. Margaret's emails became shorter and more formal. I realized that my refusal to comply with their plans had damaged something in our relationship, and that hurt more than I had expected. But it also revealed something important. Their love for me had been conditional on my willingness to defer to their judgment about my life. When I claimed the right to make my own decisions, even decisions they disagreed with, they withdrew their emotional support. This recognition was painful but also liberating. I began to see patterns in our relationship that I had accepted for decades. The way Margaret had always managed to make me feel inadequate as a grandmother. The way David had learned to avoid conflict by staying silent when his wife criticized me. The way I had apologized for things that weren't my fault and accommodated demands that weren't reasonable. Spring arrived early that year, and I threw myself into my garden with an enthusiasm I hadn't felt since Robert's death. I planted new flowers and vegetables, pruned the fruit trees, and restored the small herb garden that had been neglected during my months of grief. My weekly coffee group had evolved into something more meaningful. We supported each other through various family dramas and health scares. We celebrated small victories and mourned losses together. I realized I had found something I had been missing for years: friendships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. One afternoon in late May, I was weeding my rose garden when I heard a car in the driveway. I looked up to see David walking toward me, alone. His face was serious, and I braced myself for another lecture about my living situation. Instead, he sat down on the old wooden bench Robert had built beside the garden and was quiet for a long time. Finally, he told me that he and Margaret were having problems. Not just about me, but about many things. He was beginning to see patterns in their relationship that troubled him. He asked if I was happy with my decision to stay in the house. The question surprised me because it was the first time anyone in my family had asked about my happiness rather than my safety or practicality. I told him the truth. Yes, I was happy. Happier than I had been in years. I had rediscovered parts of myself that had been buried under decades of trying to please everyone else. I had learned to trust my own judgment again. David nodded slowly and admitted that he had been wrong to pressure me. He said Margaret had convinced him that I was being reckless and selfish. But watching me now, he could see that I was thriving. We talked for hours that afternoon, more honestly than we had in years. He told me about the stress in his marriage, about feeling caught between his wife's expectations and his love for me. I shared my own struggles with finding balance between caring for family and caring for myself. As the sun began to set, David asked if he could visit more often. Just the two of us sometimes. He wanted to rebuild our relationship without Margaret's interference, at least temporarily. I told him he was always welcome. That conversation marked a turning point. David began calling weekly, and our relationship slowly healed. He brought the children to visit without Margaret several times, and those visits were relaxed and joyful in ways they hadn't been for years. Margaret and I maintained a polite but distant relationship. She had never forgiven me for rejecting her plans for my life, and I had stopped trying to win her approval. It wasn't the relationship I had once hoped for, but it was honest. A year later, I celebrated my 74th birthday in my own garden, surrounded by friends I had chosen and family members who respected my choices. Eleanor had helped me plan a small party, and my coffee group had insisted on bringing all the food. David gave a toast that brought tears to my eyes. He thanked me for teaching him, even at his age, that it was never too late to stand up for what mattered most. He said he was proud of my courage and grateful for my example. As I looked around at the faces gathered in my garden, I realized something profound had changed in the past year. I had stopped defining myself through other people's expectations and had rediscovered my own worth. I had learned that love without respect isn't really love at all, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone else's need to control you. The roses Robert and I had planted decades ago were blooming magnificently, and the evening air was filled with their fragrance. I thought about all the seasons this garden had seen, all the storms it had weathered, all the careful tending that had brought it to this moment of beauty. Like my garden, I had learned that growth sometimes requires pruning away what no longer serves, even when that pruning is painful. I had discovered that roots run deeper than I had ever imagined, and that with proper care and boundaries, even the most neglected parts of life can bloom again. The cardinal that had once fought its reflection in my kitchen window had returned, but now it simply perched on the feeder Robert had built years ago, eating peacefully without battling phantom enemies. Perhaps it had learned the same lesson I had, that the real fight isn't with the reflection others project onto you, but with the voice inside that whispers you don't deserve to take up space in your own life. As my guests began to leave that evening, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. I had claimed my right to make choices about my own life, even when those choices disappointed people I loved. I had learned that being kind didn't require being compliant, and that setting boundaries wasn't selfish but necessary. The house felt peaceful as I cleaned up from the party, filled with the echoes of genuine laughter and honest conversation. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight I was exactly where I belonged, in the home I had chosen to keep, surrounded by the memories I had chosen to honor, living the life I had finally learned to claim as my own.